Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here. Thank you. And I'm going to open us in prayer. Father God, we thank you for this space. We thank you for this time. We thank you for bringing us here. Lord, we ask you to guide us, to direct our minds towards you, to open our hearts, open our ears, give us eyes to see, so that we may do your will. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right. Good morning, Rich. Good morning, Mary. So, today we're talking about the 144,000 and the Army of Martyrs. And last week we talked about the seven seals on the scroll and what that meant. And this week we're talking about an important question that you might have heard of, you might have heard various interpretations of, you might have read about or thought about when you come across this 144,000 with the summary of the tribes of Israel, and you've asked, well, what is this? What is this all about? We're told these are the number of the redeemed. Is this a literal number? Is this a symbolic number? What's going on with this 144,000? And so today we're going to talk a lot about the 144,000 and what it means to conquer. This is in the context of conquering, which is one of the major themes of the book of Revelation. What does it mean to conquer? When we're called to conquer and the crown of life goes to those who conquer, that's an important Christian question. If you think about, if getting to the end, getting to the wedding feast is for those who conquer, that's what we want. That's what we all go to church for. At least that's all maybe what we should go to church for, right? If you think about, I want to take this stuff seriously. What does it mean to conquer? And when we start looking into this, if you know your Judaism at the time, the Jewish context, you'll find there's a lot of military language that's used in this discussion of conquering. Is John literal about this? Does he mean we really need to take up arms and slaughter the wicked? Is that what this is about? Maybe, if we get to that conclusion today, then we'll see how to apply that in our lives, right? It doesn't look like a very militant group, but if that's what it means to conquer, and that's what gets us to the bride of the Lamb, then so be it. Or is there something else going on? What's the significance of martyrdom? Martyrdom is also part of this picture. And this will filter into the question of what it means to conquer. And then our part, in what sense is it a continuation of Christ's work by his followers, right? How are we working this out? What's the role of our martyrdom? And how is this related to the victory that's achieved by his death? So these are some of the themes we'll be looking at today. We can start back at the letter to the churches, or letters rather, to the seven churches of Asia. When John writes them, he says each of them has a promise of an eschatological reward. This is eschatological is this end times fulfillment, and it's a very rich word. It means when things are completed, when things are fulfilled, when things reach the end that God intends for them. That's what this eschatological is about. And for the one who conquers, that one is promised many things. And at the end, we find that the last of these reads, "To the one who conquers, I will give a place with me on my throne, just as I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne." And so we see here a rather significant promise. Right? Think about what this means to co-rule with Christ, right? To be given a place on Christ's throne. What does this mean? Right? To co-rule with Christ. That's a pretty serious promise, and it's given to the one who conquers. So Christ called to conquer. What does this mean? What does it mean to conquer? What's the essence of this? And how do we know? Well, we can start with finding where the conquerors begin to be described in Revelation. So the first place we find the conquerors, the victorious followers of Christ is chapter 7. They're introduced in chapter 7. And they're introduced using the traditional Jewish motif, right? It's a thematic way of talking about things of the Messianic war at the end of days. So they're introduced in military terms, and the victorious are depicted as the conquering army of the Davidic Messiah. We talked about the line of Judah and the root of David and this terminology, what it means. And so the conquerors are depicted as the army of the Messiah. And we can say, okay, well, what sort of army are they? Why are they an army? What's going on here? And our first clue that something different is going on here is using the same literary device that we already talked about when John hears, behold, the Lion of Judah, yet he sees a lamb who was slain. So the exact same words, the same device is used with the introduction of 144,000. John hears something and then sees something else. And so that should clue us in. If we're paying attention to the words, okay, what's he hearing and what's he seeing? And what's he trying to tell us with this difference? Because the one is a very traditional Jewish idea of what's going to happen at the end of days with the Davidic Messiah's army. But John's going to introduce something else. He's going to say, well, I'm going to show you what this army actually is. I'm going to show you what this army consists of. And you're part of this army. But it's not the type of army you're thinking in terms of traditional Jewish eschatology. So the hearing of the 144,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel contrasts with the seeing. He hears 144,000 and he sees an innumerable multitude from all nations. And so, well, here's a group you can count. He tells us exactly how this group is counted. But then he sees a group that's uncountable. And one group is from one nation, and the next group is from all nations. So why this distinction? What does this relate to the lion and the lamb? Right? This parallels the lamb and the lion. Christ is the lion and the lamb in chapter 5 through 6. You see the 144,000 Israelites are the followers of the Davidic Messiah. That's clear. They're the followers of the Lion of Judah. While the innumerable multitude are the people of the slaughtered lamb, the ransom of all nations. Does this mean there's two Messiahs? Does this mean that these are two different groups of people? Some people have interpreted it this way, and that okay, well, there's 144,000, and then there's the innumerable multitude, and they miss that John is hearing one thing and seeing another. Right? Fewer people do that with the lion and the lamb. That okay, well, there's one person here, and that's the lion, and that's the lamb. People see that somehow Jesus is both. But this is the same device. These are the same entity. These two images are actually depicting the same reality. And I want you to catch that before we move on, that he's using the same device. He's saying, okay, we have this reality here, but why is he making this distinction? And to understand why he makes this distinction, we have to go back into a bit of context. Whenever we read Scripture, context is important. To understand what a lamb is, you have to know something about a lamb, right? And you can read your Old Testament to see, well, what does the Old Testament say about lambs and lions? Or maybe you have some farming experience. Maybe you farm lions and, lion milk, right? And cheese, it's possible, but probably dangerous. Not recommended. But the question here is, okay, well, context. Have some context. So what's the context of this language? Why are the 144,000 an army? And why do we know this? How do we know this? Chapter 7, verses 4 through 8 is in the form of a military census. And so if you look at the language and you try to see where else do we find this in Scripture, every time a census like this is taken, it's to see what the military strength of the nation is. It's looking at men over 20 of military age, able-bodied men who are able to fight. That's what these censuses in the Old Testament are about. And so we find the same language used, the exact same formula in terms of counting up the tribes. We find that it's modeled on Numbers 1, chapter 1, 21, 23, and so on. And so we find this model in the Old Testament. We say, okay, Well, if you know your Old Testament really well, when you read Revelation, you might think, I remember reading something in Numbers that was similar to this. You go back, you check Numbers, you're like, oh yeah, it's the same form. So what's going on? God commands a census. Why does God command a military census in the book of Numbers? Well, the reason why is because it's for the conquest of the Promised Land. God is ready with God's people to move into the Promised Land. And you can say, well, there's lots of controversy there. Questions about the Canaanites, deep questions about why does God do this? But this is the context. Going into the wilderness, and it's a militaristic context. We might have issues with that militaristic context. And we can see, well, where does John come down? What's John's interpretation of this? Is this the same sort of thing John is talking about? That we're going to physically take back the Holy Land in some sort of militaristic way so God's people can live in it? Because that's what's going on here. But this was also treated as a model for the final battle, the final conflict, when God's people would once again reoccupy the Holy Land. And we find this in documents that are contemporary to John, or a little bit before John. 1 QM is Cave 1 of Qumran, and or one of the first caches of documents. And that's called that's the War Scroll. And that's an important document because there's been a lot of discussion in scholarly circles about Revelation as a Christian version of the War Scroll, or Christian sort of eschatological battle, because there's so many connections, but John goes a very different way than the War Scroll of the Essenes. But the point is, both of these documents are using the same motif, the same structure. You're counting up the military strength of Israel in order for something to happen. And we can see what the War Scroll does with that, with the Essene Jews, and then John does something quite different. 12 equal contingents from the 12 tribes of Israel. It's an army of all Israel, which you don't want to miss the significance of this. Have you ever heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel? Right? These are the upper tribes and northern tribes that are taken over by the Assyrians. The Assyrians conquer, and what do the Assyrians do with people? Well, they pretty much slaughter them. You're not going to have generations persisting after the Assyrians are finished with you. And so they're gone. They're wiped off the face of the earth. Some people had some intermixing. We don't know, the character of the intermixing might have been brutal, but these are the Samaritans. The Samaritans will show up, but they're seen as half-breeds by good Judeans at the time of Jesus. But this is the only remnant of the 10 tribes of the Samaritans at this point. And but in this list, all the tribes, there's 12,000 from each of the tribes, 12,000 men from each of the tribes. So this is a hope, this is a promise. This is what Jews hoped for at the time of John, that at the end, somehow the 10 lost tribes would come back. They would be present. And that Israel would once again fight together and live as God intended them to live in the promised land where they intended to live. So that's this deep hope. You have to get a sense of the emotional hope, the longing. You're an oppressed people who hasn't had your land for generations. And you can't even own your own house. Right? You don't have rights over your own water. And so you're there, and you're thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful, once again, to have the land that God promised us? So you can get in the emotional space of this. The Messiah comes back, leads the armies to receive this land, and rather than 144,000, though, John says, he sees an innumerable multitude. We also find this word, the exact phrase, if you're using your Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament that John would have been using at the time. We find this in Genesis 13:16. This idea that your descendants would be innumerable, right? Like the stars in the heavens, like the sands and on the ground, right? So the idea, like, count up the grains of sand, count the stars, and this is how innumerable your descendants will be. So this idea of innumerable is coming from the promise of Abraham, the promise to Abraham. And so this is a promise fulfilled. John is saying, okay, this promise is now being fulfilled. And we see this. This is what John sees. Who are these people? They're from many nations. Abraham will be a blessing to all the nations, all the families of the earth. And so here we see this. Then they're sealed. We read in 7:1-3, that the servants of God are sealed. And John hears the number sealed as the 144,000. So we say, okay, again, who is this 144,000? Why are they sealed? The sealing is very interesting if you look at the ancient context and you look at the biblical context. The sealing has a double significance. On the first hand, they're sealed for ownership. They're sealed as servants, as doulos, literally as slaves, right? So they're sealed as for ownership, and they're sealed for protection against the plagues that are about to come, right? So when the crazy scorpion creatures with the long hair and, with the scorpion tails and looking like locusts and the faces of men, what are these things? And they torment, the same word that Jesus uses for torment, the torturers, that if you don't forgive from your heart, well, then I'm going to throw you over to the torturers. Same word used for torturers. So whether this is conscience, whether this is physical, who knows? We really don't know. But we know that they are not of this world. They're from Gehenna. And they have a king who is following the law of the commands of God. Right? So, but those who are sealed are not affected by these locust scorpion creatures or the other plagues. So they're protected, but they're also God's servants, right? You'd seal things you owned. And in the Roman context, you would seal people you owned. You put your seal on your slaves, on your servants, right? And so whether that's in the form of a tattoo, there's controversy, was this tattooing or branding? This is something when Constantine became the emperor. He outlawed no more branding or tattooing of servants, right? But this is the language being used at this point. Sealed for protection and ownership. It's a mark of protection because it's also a mark of ownership. So these work together. If we look in the Bible where we find things like this, we'll find Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 9, verses 4 through 6, talk about God commanding an angel of the Lord, and he says, go throughout Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of the men sighing and groaning over all the abominations committed there. And these men will later be used for one of God's purposes. And if you don't have the mark, well, then it's not good for you. Right? There's actually a meme going around when I looked at this verse that quotes the next part. You go and slaughter everyone else. Right? It's like, okay. And the meme says, thank God I'm not a Christian. Right? Because it's like, what kind of God is this that would only save some and then slaughter everyone else in the city? And again, we're thinking, okay, well, this is a very militaristic context. John is using this imagery. What does John mean by this imagery? And we'll find how he transforms it in a moment. Job is also sealed. That's another place we significantly find the sealing language in the same way. Job is sealed, so Satan can't kill him. His life is protected. He's allowed to be tormented and tested, but not killed. And we read about Job being sealed. Job's struggle with Satan is described in terms of both a wrestling match and a battle. Lots of militaristic language used in Job's struggle with Satan. And so if we're looking for seals and looking for themes that are repeated in Revelation, we find this in Ezekiel, we find this in Job. Job comes through, his victories through his endurance, which is similar language that's used in Revelation in 13:10 and 14:12. And in Ezekiel, we find that both Ezekiel and Job are cited in other contemporary documents. The Damascus document is a contemporary Dead Sea Scroll, which references Ezekiel in light of the end times, right? So it's again using this in an end times context, saying this is going to happen again. At the end of days, God is going to seal his people again and slaughter the wicked, right? So God's going to seal those who are doing his will and slaughter the wicked. That's what the Essenes are saying. We find that these themes are used throughout. John will use these themes, but he'll have a different take on it. Unlike the angel of Ezekiel, who makes a mark, so we read when Ezekiel's angel makes a mark, it's actually we're told beforehand he has a writing kit. So he saw the writing kit, and the angel takes up a pen and permanent marker maybe. Makes the mark, it's gonna wash off after the slaughter, you could say. But John's angel has a much deeper seal. It's a much more deeper seal. So it's a deeper seal. We're told it's the seal of the living God. with which to brand his doulos, his slaves, his servants. And if we look at a contemporary document, again, the War Scroll, the faithful Israelites marked in Ezekiel 9. So this is commenting on Ezekiel 9, saying this is what's going to happen at the end of time. But we see that there are the instruments also in the Messianic army after, at the end of time. The 144,000, in a similar way, are sealed, protected, and owned in order to serve the line and fulfill their purpose as the Messianic army. So they're protected. They have this purpose of the Messianic army. And we can ask, well, what is their purpose? What is the nature of their conquering? And that's the question that arises. We're also told that these are those who came out, or are coming out of, or come out of, more literally, the Great Tribulation. So we can ask, well, what's that? Is that after the rapture? What's going on? You'll find in Revelation there's no mention of the rapture or anything like it. That's trying to work other parts of Scripture into Revelation. So, the reason we're not talking about the rapture, maybe we can talk about at the end sort of misinterpretations or something like that. But that's not in here. But people try to say, okay, what's the tribulation? What is this? This was actually a technical term. So we actually know exactly what it is from contemporary documents. There's no mystery what the tribulation is. It goes back to Daniel 12:1. But at the time of John, it was a technical term for the great eschatological war. So the Great Tribulation, the phrase used, means it's a war. It's an eschatological war. It's the big war at the end of time, where the Messianic army will conquer God's enemies. And so we find examples of this interpretation in the War Scroll, again, a contemporary document in the time of battle against the Gentiles. But what is the battle? So we have a battle, we have an army, but what is the battle? That's the question we want to know. Well, in this battle, they wash the robes. This is also militaristic language. Washing the robes is how you talk about a victory in a holy war. Right? After you slaughter your enemy, your robes are filled with blood. Right? So you wash them to be ritually pure. You can't have the blood of cadavers on your robes and then go worship in the temple. I mean, someone shows up with bloody clothes to church. That's not very seemly, right? So you wash your clothes after you slaughter your enemies before you go to church. They did in those days too, right? Before you participate in worship. We find in the War Scroll, again, the Holy Army, the morning after victory, is to wash their robes for ritual purification before taking part in the prayers and thanksgiving, and in singing the new song. New song is also a song of victory when you've destroyed your enemies. So that's another phrase. And they sing a new song. Right? We even have that in our hymns. All these words are militaristic words. In the War Scroll, they wash themselves in the blood of the guilty cadavers. Right, as an image of relishing this victory. Right? Not only are you slaying the wicked, but you're bathing in their blood. Right? So it's literally a bloodbath in the War Scroll. And we say, well, what is John doing? John's using the same language. These folks are washing themselves in blood. Well, what are they doing? Right? Revelation is directly echoing this, but John gives us a startling paradox. And he says, well, whose blood are they washing themselves in? And what's this blood doing? John is connecting the ritual purification with the blood of the Lamb. And saying they're washing themselves in the blood of the Lamb. And guess what this blood does? It doesn't make them ritually impure. It makes them clean. Right? So John is connecting these traditions and saying, okay, the blood of Christ is what they're washing themselves in, not the guilty cadavers. The blood of Christ. And rather than making them impure, this is also at the same time what does make them pure. So John's using this imagery to give us something very different than the War Scroll. You can imagine Jews who were familiar with the War Scroll waiting for this end times battle, and then John over here saying, no, this is the true revelation of what's going to go on in the last days. This is a decisive reinterpretation of this Jewish holy war motif. And we're going to talk a bit more about how he reinterprets it. The blood of the Lamb. So Revelation 7:14 is an allusion to Daniel 12:1. 11:35 and 12:10. In Daniel 11:33 through 35, those who are wise, in Revelation we read, for those who have understanding, those who are wise, and these are the good people, right? These are the good people. What happens in this passage is they fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder, and this is in order to purify them, to refine them, and to make them white, right? To make them pure. These same three verbs appear again later in Daniel. We read that many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined. So Daniel's using this, and this is another eschatological conflict passage. Right? At the end times, the wise will be tested, and this will purify them. This testing will purify them. So when we think, well, what does it mean for them to wash themselves? Right? These 144,000 are washing themselves or have washed themselves, right? And they've been made pure, and the blood of the Lamb has to do with that. It's not the Lamb washing them, but they're washing themselves. And so we find similar language in Daniel where they're making themselves pure, and John is using this to understand the testing and purifying process in Daniel to be their martyrdom. Right? He sees martyrdom as connected to this purifying process. This is contrary to the War Scrolls understanding of the purifying in Daniel. The War Scroll sees the purifying in Daniel as the purifying of the wicked, right? To get the purging the wicked from out of the community. So two different interpretations of what sort of purifying, purging is going on. John is seeing this as the testing of them rather than the purifying of the community, right? And John takes the purification to be the martyr's purification. Those who die are being purified through their martyrdom, through their dying, through their giving their lives. And so he takes the great tribulation of Daniel 12. Again, that great tribulation comes from Daniel. And he sees this as a time of persecution where the people of God triumph not through fighting, not through purging, through killing the wicked, but through their own self-sacrifice. Right? The way they're purged is through their own martyrdom, their own, and again, martyrdom, the word martyrdom in Greek is where we get the term witness from. So it's the same thing. Be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and to the ends of the earth. If you look up the Greek, you're, okay, martyr. Be my martyrs in Jerusalem, Judea, and through the ends of the earth. Right? The Great Commission is, okay, go out, be my martyrs. And so you say, well, what's the connection? Not everyone died, but Jesus called us to death. Take up your cross and follow me. Right? Die to self. Lots of death language. So it's deeper than just one act of martyrdom, you could say. The point here is the washing themselves, this language John's using, rather than the Lamb washing them, right, is they're giving up their own lives. It's not that Jesus says, okay, I'm going to send you out to battle and just have you slaughtered. No, the emphasis is, no, these are volunteers. Even though they're servants, they're volunteers, right? They're signing up for this. This is not something that Jesus is forcing them to do. They're on board in their own free will, right? So this focus of giving themselves up, washing themselves up, but it's also in the example of the Lamb. It's the Lamb's blood that they're washing themselves in. So it's an interesting play on the Lamb's blood on the one hand is what's doing the work, but they're using it to wash themselves, right? In this the way John sets this up. So 7:14 thus transmutes the meaning of traditional Jewish holy war imagery of the rest of the chapter and brings it into line with the vision of the Lamb that was introduced in chapter 5. The Messianic army is innumerable. It's an innumerable army of self-sacrificial lambs. You can see this as an army of lambs who triumph through their martyrdom because they're following the Lamb who was slain. They participate in Christ's victory by following his path to death. This is very different language. It's very active. It's not passive language. It's militaristic. But the form of the militarism is through self-sacrifice. And there's some interesting paradoxes here. So in Revelation 14:4, we also read some interesting verses, right? If you're trying to make sense of this, you're thinking, okay, if the 144,000 are the redeemed, and I'm supposed to be part of that, well, part of their description, and these are parts people kind of, either they emphasize these like crazy, and they set up a sort of, often sometimes cults have emerged from this stuff. So, okay, well, these are people who were virgins, right? Which were not sexually defiled with women. Okay, well, does that include? Who does that include in this room? Right? You can count yourselves and say, am I part of the 144,000? Why is John using this way of talking about things? Well, this goes back again to the holy war context. Sexual purity in the time of battle was required. We find lots of requirements for this, for the people who are fighting, and these are men who are fighting, right? So specifically saying sleeping with women because they're men who are fighting. Also other types of sexuality is described in these calls to ritual purity before fighting, and so this goes back to it. John will transform this language too. He'll tell us, okay, this is sexual defilement, but I'm going to give you a deeper purity. We'll see that in a moment. How John transforms this language. Some people, again, the Essenes, the folks who wrote the war scroll, took this so seriously that they were avowed celibates, right? They were, the Qumran community was a celibate community because they were always battle ready in the ritually pure sense. They wanted to be part of this 144,000 in the very literalistic sense. So they would not be defiled. And they were waiting out in the wilderness, literally in a compound out in the wilderness. This is probably where John the Baptist got some of his wilderness theology, because he was in that area and he used a lot of verses that were really their verses. So the connections with Christians, lots of them probably became Christians too, right? So John's talking to them too. But the point is, they were ready for this battle. They were waiting, and they were taking these purity standards very literally, waiting for the holy war at the end of days. In the 70s, when the Romans, the Jewish Revolution, they entered this and got slaughtered. The last layers are a bunch of Roman arrowheads and fire ash, right? So the compound was destroyed. They fought, and they lost. And you have to wonder, if you're in a scene there fighting against the Gentiles, who finally attacked you. You're waiting your whole life for the Gentiles to attack, and they attack, and then you lose. Right? And if you escape from that, well, how do I understand this? How do I understand? The conflict has happened, and we lost. How do I make sense of this? So that's part of this context, too. So John wants to transform this. The equivalent of sexual purity in John's ideal of the church is not ritual defilement or virginity per se, but even a deeper moral purity that is connected with the sacrificial imagery. So again, he uses the same language, but he transforms it. He says, okay, well, let's go back to the lamb. What's required for a lamb? What has to be without blemish? It has to be pure. Or the lamb to be sacrificed is spotless. Right? We say pure and spotless lamb when we sing about Jesus. And this is what John is using this. He's saying, okay, well, I'm going to take this sexual purity and I'm going to make it deeper, and we're going to say, okay, blameless. John transforms this into blamelessness, right? And so he uses this word blameless, which is a physical perfection required. But when John interprets this, he says, in their mouth no lie was found. Right? So that's the beginning. It's like, okay, well, how does John interpret this? He says, okay, these are people who stand for the truth. These are people who aren't lying. These are people who aren't false. And this is how he's interpreting this the 144,000 in terms of blameless. So that's connected, right? They're pure, and he says, in their mouth no lie was found. And we find this also in the Old Testament, in Zephaniah 3:13. We find that the eschatological people of God, the end times people of God, shall not be deceitful, right? A deceitful tongue shall not be found in their mouths. In Isaiah 53:9, we find that the lamb who was led to the slaughter had no, well, that should be an L, no lie. Sometimes when I transpose stuff, L's become F's and strange things happen. So no lie. Medieval or something. But no lie was found in their mouth, right? So this question, okay, the lamb who was slain, no lie was found in their mouths. So here's the followers, and no lie was found in their mouth. John is connecting all this Old Testament imagery with the followers, with Jesus. He's saying, okay, these are people who are little lambs. They're just like Jesus. They're little lambs who followed their leader lamb wherever he goes. And it literally says that, right? They follow him wherever he goes, and then they're called the first fruits. Another very interesting term. Maybe you've come across first fruits. First fruits is also in the context of sacrifice. The first fruits were from the grain harvest, and they were, you would, before you do the rest of the reaping, this is reaping terminology. We've talked about the grim reaper. Well, the first fruits are, the first fruits that are sacrificed to God before all the rest of the reaping is done. But it's a token. It means the rest of the harvest is coming, right? So this is the beginning of a huge harvest, but it's also a sacrifice, right? Don't lose that the first fruits are burned to God, right? These are a sacrifice. So even though there's something good here, they're being taken by God and accepted by God, they're also a sacrifice. And this goes into the martyrdom theme, right? Following means imitating both his truthfulness as faithful witness. Faithful witness also means faithful martyrs, and the sacrificial death, which Jesus went to voluntarily. Right. So thus the victory of the Lamb's army is the victory of the truthful witness maintained even as far as sacrificial death. In Revelation 4:14, the three images of Messianic warfare, Passover sacrifice, faithful witness, and the idea of right. So the Lamb, warfare, and witness. This idea of martyrdom as witness, the Lamb who was slain, and warfare, the Messianic army, are all merged to reinterpret this idea of the end times conflict. So the conquerors, right? These are the conquerors, and this is how they conquered. Get back to conquering. The conquerors who celebrate their victory in heaven, ascribing it to God and the Lamb, have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. This means that they are the martyrs. They are martyrs who triumph through participating through their own deaths in the sacrificial death of the Lamb. They have followed the Lamb even unto death. Right? This is what it means to conquer. This is what it means to follow the Lamb, to be martyred to self. And this is not new with John. Right? Jesus says, if you want to follow me, what do you have to do? Take up your cross. Right? Deny yourself. Right? Die to self. This is all very New Testament focused language. John is just wrapping it up. He's saying, no, this is true. This is, you follow Jesus through dying to self, and this will transform the world. We'll find when we talk about how the nations actually repent, we'll see this is the key, and the two witnesses filter into this too, because they give up their lives for the sake of their witness. So we see that this is the essence of conquering, right? Who has conquered? We read in Revelation 12:11, they have conquered the evil one by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony / martyrdom, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. So it gives us, it connects it for us there. So, okay, how did they conquer? They didn't cling to their life, even in the face of death, for the sake of their witness to the Lamb. When they were threatened with death, when they were killed, they did not cling to life. That is who conquers. Those are the conquerors in Revelation. Those are the ones who co-rule with Christ. And so, by the blood of the Lamb, it refers not only to Christ's death, but to the deaths of Christian martyrs who followed Christ's example. Right? They bear witness even at the cost of their lives, right? So they're conquering by his blood, in their own blood too, right? They're dying for the sake of and in the power of the blood of the Lamb. So connecting this imagery, right, of washing themselves. How are they washing themselves? They're voluntarily giving their lives for the sake of their witness to the Lamb who was slain. The new song, then, is sung after these combatants of the Messianic war face the dragon and the beast on Mount Zion. This is the final conflict. The 144,000 appear again in 12 through 14, and in 14 we see them standing over against the beast, the two beasts, and the dragon, who's Satan, and they win. Right? And they sing a new song, which is holy war terminology. Whenever you won a battle, you'd sing this phrase, a new song. And this is a hymn of fresh victory when the divine warrior, the warrior that God appoints, whether it's an angel or a human being, has defeated his foes. And we find this throughout the Old Testament and also in the book of Judith, which is in the Catholic Deuterocanon. We find references to this new song that's sung by God's victors. So lots of stuff there. We could go on and on about this terminology and this context of 144,000. Always amazes me with Revelation. You could look at something like 10 verses and just spend hours talking about those 10 verses and going through the Old Testament and finding connections. And, I thought I was going to talk about the two witnesses today, too. I thought, I ended up with, there's 150 slides in this presentation. I gave you 20, right? So this is Revelation. You just think, where do I stop? You just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's the nature of Revelation. I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I'm just scratching the surface. But there's so much there. And I want us to live in that, to feel it, to say, okay, yeah, how can my life be transformed by this book as I go deeper and deeper into it? So a few questions that I'm hoping will get us into that conversation. Questions that I often think about, as I read this. I think, is this true? Is this relevant? Does this have meaning for me? Does this have meaning for us in our context? So one question I thought of was, if God has the power to stop evil by use of force, I often wish God would just stop the evil. Why do you think God chooses the way of the self-sacrificing lamb? Why do you think God chooses that way rather than just stopping evil with all of his power and all of his might? Secondly, and this is related to the first question, do you think self-sacrifice after the example of Jesus really has the power to change the hearts of sinners? So I'm talking about our self-sacrifice. Do you think that really has the power to change people, to bring them closer to God? Or do you think a show of miracles would be better? Do you think God should really, rather than trying to train us to give our lives up, should God really be giving us the power of miracles to impress? If we could just go out on the streets. How many people on Hopkins could we convert to Christianity if we could bring down a pillar of fire right now, to consume, something? I don't know, someone parking illegally. And the neighbors would cheer, yes. I wanted these, I hate illegal things. Finding something contextual in Berkeley. Or self-sacrifice. Is that more transformative than something like that? Thirdly, do you try to live out, take up your cross and follow me? Right, Jesus commands that. Do you ever try to live that out in your life? If so, how? Right? So the first question is, do you try that? And if so, how? All right, 3 questions. You could treat any of them or all of them. Let's try to do groups of 5 and talk for about 10 minutes or so. And then we'll regather for a few minutes and see what insights we have.